he comes out throwing the long calf kick to the lead leg and with his gloves by his chin, sort of Tyson-esque influence. And then when you step in, he tries to time the right hand across the top and just swings right hook, left hook, right hook. It's not super technical. He looked amazing against Brian Ortega, who has shown pretty good boxing in the past, but it seemed to be largely because he was able to counter Brian Ortega's jab with the right hand across the top early. Brian Ortega never really recovered, and then he was just throwing hands hard whenever they came into contact. And this is what's quite curious about Diogo Lopes and what intrigues me about this fight. In many respects, he does not have the deep bag of tricks that Volkanovski does, certainly not on the feet. His wrestling is okay. His shot a takedown against Dan Ige when he was gassed, but he hit his knees on the single. And I went, you don't want to be doing that against Dan Ige. And then Dan Ige just sort of stood on one leg and let him get up and run through him again, which was really weird because Dan Ige looked fresh and Lopez looked really bad in the last round of that fight. But Lopez seems to have fewer tricks. He's a less slick fighter, in my humble opinion. But he does have some stuff, both physically and habitually, that match up really well with Volkanovski, as in to make Volkanovski look bad. The right hand across the top of the jab, obviously that is what smoked Volkanovski against Topuria, or was the beginning of the end. And that's Lopez's favourite counter. The way that Lopez grabs the double collar tie whenever someone comes close is also does not bode well for Volkanovski, because when you are the shorter fighter, what Volkanovski does is that he fights as the shorter fighter, and I always say that's a disadvantage in most ways. Like, there are a couple of things that are easier when you're the shorter fighter, but most of the time it's harder. We were talking about this with Nabil versus Superleg the other week because it was such a profound difference. I think it'll probably be quite a similar difference here. Okay, so Volk's 5'6", and Lopez is 5'11", so it's not that bad actually, but it's a pretty significant difference in height. When you are the shorter guy, every time you come close, if the opponent slaps on the double collar tie, he can hold you against his chest and he can wear on you much easier than if you were the same height as him and you're both wrestling to try and get that inside control and get the collar ties. And it was something I picked up on in the first Makhachev fight. Makhachev was having really good success with it, but he didn't really abuse it that much. If you watch the second Makhachev fight, every time Volkanovski comes close, Makhachev grabs his head with both hands and goes, "You're not having that back, I'm going to knee you." And Makhachev's a big fan of the double collar tie anyway, so it was really a choice to attack it more in the second fight than in the first. But it gives him a real problem. It's a horrible thing to have to deal with, because even if you push the guy to the fence and he's got the double collar tie and you're trying to lock your hands around his body or whatever, his elbows are still in front of your collarbones. It's very hard to pop them out without being out of range, without extending his arms. And when he's so tall, and when he's a lot taller than you, extending his arms by framing on him, you might not even get them straight enough to pop off properly. There's the other end of that, because my boy Sadiq Youssef might be listening today, actually. When he grabbed a double collar tie on Lopez, Lopez just kept swinging. He didn't let him set his elbows and pull him in. He just swung he swung like 4 punches and an uppercut went up the middle and stunned Youssef. And he did it again later on, and I think that was the finish. But swinging out of the double collar tie is really that's more a preventative defense. You swing as hard as you can, as hard and as fast as you can as they're reaching out to you. Volkanovski got caught reaching out towards Topuria as well once he was hurt. But if the guy gets behind your head and gets his elbows in front of your body and actually clamps down on it, swinging from there is very hard because his elbows are checking your collars, your collarbones and your shoulders, so you can't even swing that hard. That was Andy Hoog's answer to getting double collar tied in the early K1 events. He just threw a big overhead and knocked the guy out because the guy was a foot taller than him. But yeah, so that's quite interesting. The overhead across the top, I'm not as concerned about. If you watched Volkanovski versus Topuria, and there was another one, Topuria's brother Alexander, in his fight with Colby Thickness, it was a similar sort of matchup because Thickness was being trained or being coached by or cornered by Volkanovski and had trained with Volkanovski a lot. And Alex Topuria, was trying to adopt a similar sort of style to Ilia Topuria. They taught themselves to box from YouTube videos, apparently. But in both those fights, Thickness and Volkanovski had success jabbing and double jabbing out in the open. And really, it went to pot when they started getting close towards the fence, because they'd try and circle around the cage with nowhere behind them to fall back into, and they'd be popping the jab out. And it's something peculiar that happens once guys get back towards the cage. When they don't have the retreat, they start circling and jabbing, and normally their head comes up too. They look very worried. A lot of guys, that is. And both Thickness did it a bit and Volkanovski did it a bit too. But it goes from being annoying out in the open to, if you're trying to jab and circle along the cage, you're trying to do offensive work from a position where your main concern should be getting out of there. And not like get out of there, Travis, but you should be working back towards the center because that favors you so much more. If you watch the Thickness Topuria fight, it's the same thing. If you watch the Max versus Ilia fight, they love pressuring guys towards the fence, and then you can come in behind some big punches, knowing that the guy's flattened out along the fence, and he will be flattened out along the fence. He doesn't have anywhere to retreat, so he's got a good chance of swarming in on him. Even if he covers up, you won't hit anything good on the first punch, but if you throw 3 or 4, or you get in their chest and you expect them to jab at you while they're circling. If they lash out at you and you hit them with the overhand, I mean, that's been a number of Ilia Topuria's best fights, has been pressuring guys down towards the fence, hitting them with the overhand across the top of the jab, the cross counter, or as they circle. I was talking about Beterbiev versus Bivol last week, but that was about 5 rounds, 6 rounds of that fight, probably. In the middle was Bivol circling, Beterbiev winging the right hand from that side as hard as he could every time they hit the ropes. It works really well. But I don't see a lot of that from Diego Lopez. So overhand across the top of the jab is a great counter, but this is a textbook example of how there's always more going on, or often more going on. Ilia Topuria's overhand across the top of Alex Volkanovski's jab happened because of where they were in the cage, and it was a bad time for Volkanovski to be jabbing, and it was a great time for Topuria to be swinging. Out in the open, where Volkanovski can move and feint and double jab and slap jab. I love when he did this to Topuria too, because I'm always saying target Topuria's backhand. I was always saying that about Volkanovski when he was fighting, when he was lined up against Makhachev the second time. I was like, I would be throwing high kicks into that arm all the time. But Volkanovski was doing this thing where he'd slap his lead hand into the side of Topuria's guard and then jab down the center. Loved that. But yeah, I think out in the open, even though there's this massive height disparity and probably reach disparity, I don't expect that overhand across the top of the jab to be anywhere near as effective as when Ilia Topuria is pressuring you to the fence. And that's something else I noticed about Lopez. Pressure. It's more aggression. He's not using the cage. He's going forward, and if you hit the cage, that's your problem. Ilia Topuria, it's going forward, pressuring you towards the cage with the intention of using that cage to cut off some of your options and making you a better target and making you panic. Diego Lopez, as good as he's been, he looks like a fighter who just fights wherever it's happening. And then the third thing that was really intriguing to me about their matchup physically and technically, when Volkanovski uses his takedowns, he tends to land in closed guard, which is where Diego Lopez does a lot of his work. Now, Diego Lopez is the jiu-jitsu coach of Alexa Grasso, who did nothing to stand up against Valentina Shevchenko, didn't even try. And if you watch Lopez versus Evloev, he doesn't really try to stand up. At no point do his feet come in front of Evloev and kick him away. At no point does he get up to a hand or an elbow. He's basically just working off his back and attacking, which, compare that to Charles Oliveira, who is attacking in the course of getting up. Very different. As good as he is off his back, he seems to be missing a large part of that BJ Penn holy trinity of sweep, submit, or stand up. But he's a tall guy in the weight class. He loves locking his legs over the shoulder, which is a doubly effective thing if you're very tall compared to your opponent. And Volkanovski lands himself in the closed guard quite a lot. If you watch his fights with like Yair, Ortega, Max in the was it the second or the third fight he finally hit a takedown? Jeremy Kennedy, he kept taking him down into closed guard along the fence with the inside trip, and Kennedy would open his own guard and make Volkanovski go to the half guard. He'd ask him to advance so that he could start wrestling up, because you can't wrestle up with your head against the fence from closed guard. And a lot of it is the inside trip, which is kind of interesting because it matches up with someone else who's on this card, Patricio Pitbull, a very short fighter for his division. You know, I think, is he 5'6" as well? Yeah, he's also 5'6" featherweight. He also presses people to the fence, uses the underhook to pull them off the fence and hits the inside trip, the old Randy Couture special, and lands himself in closed guard. So it's kind of intriguing that Volkanovski, if he does want to change it up on Lopez and put Lopez on his back, he tends to do it in a way that actually puts Lopez in a position where he's been pretty dangerous historically. Now, that being said, you know, when Alexander Volkanovski fought Yair Rodriguez, I was like, I want to see, I've always wanted to see someone kick him on the open side, hammer that rear hand, really make use of the height disparity and the range disparity, really put him off ducking, punish him for ducking. And then I came out of talking about that matchup in the pre-fight and being like, damn, Yair could be a hard matchup for him. And Volkanovski handled him beautifully. I think the stuff that Yair brought genuinely was a threat to Volkanovski stylistically, and Volkanovski diffused it perfectly. So there's those three things about Diego Lopez that intrigue me in this fight. And then there's the fact that Volkanovski might be slowing down. He might be getting worse. A lot of people on Twitter be like, Volkanovski's washed, I'm done with the sport and so on. The loss to Topuria was a hard one. I did think, and you know, coming off that knockout loss to Islam Makhachev too, which it means like in the last, well, he hasn't won since July 2023, and his last two fights he got knocked out. Didn't look bad in the Topuria fight. Did look, you know, the second Islam fight, I thought he fought as confidently as he normally does, and Islam Makhachev correctly identified the stuff that was giving Volkanovski trouble in the first fight and eschewed the stuff that wasn't working. Because a lot of that first fight is Islam Makhachev trying takedowns that aren't working, trying to show off his boxing, but getting into sort of even exchanges a lot of the time. His boxing did look really good in that first fight, but the second fight, he's just like, why am I doing that when I could be abusing my height and reach? Not abusing, using correctly. It's like when people say contained steroid abuse, and you're like, well, are they getting stronger? Because that's not abusing it.